BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. At the end of our most recent Zodiac Killer series on Thomas Henry Horan, I said that there was a possibility that we might explore the book Most Evil Part 2 by Steve Hodel, which explores the possibility that his father, George Hill Hodel, was a Zodiac Killer suspect. But I had some reservations about that because I was like, what's the point of doing a 17-part series on an idea that I don't genuinely believe? And not only do I not believe it, there's such a low likelihood of it being true. But at the same time, it is something that somebody has proposed, and there are a lot of discussions about it on the internet, and Steve Hodel is featured on numerous programs talking about his father, George Hill Hodel, how he believes that he was the Black Dahlia Avenger, how he murdered Elizabeth Short in California, as well as a host of other crimes, such as the lipstick murders in Chicago, and perhaps things internationally, such as murders in the Philippines, and maybe some that we're not even aware of. In short, he's saying that his father, George Hill Hodel, was a notorious serial killer who would change his identity from time to time. But what's the connection to the Zodiac Killer? Well, Steve Hodel has a YouTube video out called Signature MO's Avenger Zodiac Video, Steve Hodel Crime Comparisons. That's available on his channel, Steve Hodel. And we're not going to read the entire book, Most Evil Part 2, because once again, I don't believe that it's worthy of a 17-part series. What I would say instead is that somebody has proposed this idea, they want to talk about it, let's talk about it. And I come from the James Randi school of thought, where James Randi said that he didn't want to be called a debunker. He wanted to be called an investigator, because it's not about proving somebody wrong. It's about trying to get closer to the truth. And to do so, we're just going to go out full swinging at Steve Hodel's theory that his father, George Hill Hodel, was the Zodiac Killer, the Black Dahlia Avenger, and committing numerous murders around the world. Let's look at some of the claims that he made. The first one that I would say that's featured in this video is that both the Zodiac Killer and the Black Dahlia Avenger were serial killers. And you really find, though, that when he's talking about the Zodiac Killer, very, very general. If you listen to Steve Hodel's presentations about the Black Dahlia murder and the connections between the lipstick murders in Chicago, there actually are some specifics. They were both serial killers. What does that have to do with anything? I mean, that's just taking two different serial killers and perhaps creating a connection that may or may not be there. That is like the most general thing that you could ever possibly say. On to something a little more specific. Created his own marketing public relations campaign, along with inventing and providing newspapers with a pseudonym for them to use in headlining his crimes and his reign of terror. So, in short, the Black Dahlia Avenger and the Zodiac Killer. And a big thing in Steve Hodel's theory is that he says that George Hill Hodel was committing crimes and he was changing the identity of the boogeyman in the dark. Sometimes he's using this name, and sometimes he's using that name. If I can understand, that's just a way so that he would not get caught, so people would not figure these things out. But in terms of the actions of the Black Dahlia and the actions of the Zodiac Killer, George Hill Hodel was a surgeon. I mean, when you listen to Steve Hodel talk about him, he really does sound like a fascinating person. And I think Steve Hodel said in one of his interviews that George Hill Hodel is the most fascinating person he ever met. I mean, the guy was a reporter, he was an investigator, he was a surgeon, he traveled the world. He seems like an interesting person, but at the same time, did he actually have anything to do with these Zodiac Killer murders? We had an interesting comment come in about Richard Gaikowski and the Lake Berryessa stabbings of Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Ann Shepard, saying that Geik was an army medic. There is no possible way that an army medic would have been able to leave Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard in the condition in which they were in. Both victims survived the Lake Berryessa stabbing. Cecilia Ann Shepard did not pass away until 2 days later in the hospital. Brian Hartnell survived and went on to live his life. An army medic should have had the awareness that the victims were still alive. Thank you once again to Jamie for that comment. But at the same time, George Hill Hodel was a surgeon. Not only a surgeon, he was an expert surgeon. And if Steve Hodel claims that he has the capability to bisect Elizabeth Short to the point where he's cutting through the second and third lumbar vertebrae, not damaging any of her internal organs. And this expert surgeon wouldn't have been able to tell if these people were dead. I mean, that is just so far beyond belief. Or just to go about it in this method, to go about it trying to stab them the way that he did. Absolutely zero medical knowledge is in the Zodiac killings. Not to say anything completely about some of the other material, but in the shootings at Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs, the stabbings at Lake Berryessa, the stabbing of Paul Stein, the taxi driver, all of that lacks medical knowledge, and that lacks someone who is a surgeon, who knows the human anatomy. I just don't see it there. If there's any connection to that, I don't see it. Moreover, I would say that George Hill Hodel would have been in his 60s, and this is some of the stuff we mentioned previously on the channel, but just to reiterate, none of the Zodiac descriptions really talk about a man in their 60s. We have reports of people saying that the Zodiac Killer was as young as mid-20s, maybe even younger. I mean, I don't really believe that Grandpa is out there, like to commit these murders. But at the same time, I think, though, that Steve Hodel's response to why the Zodiac killings lack the medical knowledge is that George Hill Hodel might have been too old to perform the surgery, perform something like the murder of Elizabeth Short, so then he would have been more inclined to do something like the Lake Berryessa stabbing, but that's stretching the truth to an endless degree. Now, some of the other claims that are made in this video. The Zodiac contacted and taunted the press by telephone after his crimes. Now, I would really like to know the specific instances that he's talking about when he says the Zodiac taunted the press by telephone. I mean, we have just countless letters that were mailed into the press. You got to put this on the front page of your newspaper. Otherwise, it's going to unleash even more terror upon the city. We do have the Zodiac calling into the TV show, but that thing was a hoax. That was someone who was just pretending to be the Zodiac, and I think that's taken care of. Another one here is that they both have egomaniacal personalities, and they demand constant media publicity and front-page coverage of their killings under the threat of additional killings. This is something that both the Black Dahlia Avenger and the Zodiac Killer have in common. I'll give them credit for that. I mean, most serial killers do not want something like that. Most serial killers are trying to lay low, but once again, these would be the sexually motivated killers who are just like, they have this urge that they need to satiate. The way that a normal person might be getting in the mood for sex, they're getting in the mood for a sexually motivated homicide, so they need to stay under wraps. And there's some people that might seek a little bit of media attention. There's some people that might seek a little bit of media coverage, but these guys are, we're talking about the Black Dahlia Avenger and the Zodiac Killer. Yes, they did mail in counsel's letters, they did taunt the press, and Jack the Ripper is another one that Steve Hodel cites as an example about how this is done from time to time. But that actually hurts his case, just to show that, is his father also Jack the Ripper? No, this is something that is done frequently by serial killers. And they all address their mailings to the editor. They address their press mailings to the editor, rather. What I would say about that one is, well, when you're writing the editor of a newspaper and you say to the editor, well, what should they say? Hey, bud. Hey, pal. I'm the Zodiac Killer. Of course they're going to say to the editor if they're writing to the editor. What is he talking about? I know I'm just sounding a little bit hyped up, but at the same time, this guy wrote a book saying that, he has a Zodiac Killer suspect. Let's talk about it. Both the Zodiac Killer and the Black Dahlia Avenger used a knife, a gun, and a rope in separate crimes. I mean, I do give him something there because it's very abnormal for a serial killer to change their weapon. It's very abnormal for a serial killer to go about things in a different way. Ted Bundy was all about blunt force trauma, and even other people like Glenn Rogers, the Casanova Killer, he was almost always using the knife. But at the same time, there's one possibility that Glenn Rogers strangled somebody. We could talk about that later on in a different upload. So we have that they use a knife, a gun, and a rope. What did John Oliver say the rope is? Mankind's third invention? Oh no, he used a rope. That's not significant of anything. It's rope. Rope. And that goes into our next point. Both the Black Dahlia Avenger and the Zodiac Killer carried pre-cut pieces of clothesline to their crime scenes. And we should be very clear about that. The only time that I can think of the Zodiac did something like that was at Lake Berryessa, if we're going to look at the confirmed Zodiac activity, not at Blue Rock Springs, Lake Herman Road, or in Presidio Heights. So that only happened one time, but they both used pre-cut lengths of clothesline to tie up their victims. Well, imagine if they didn't. That reminds me of just Larry David on SNL. I carry everything loose in my arms. What, are they just going to drag the whole coil behind them? All right, let's see how much we need now. Unwind this here. Okay, that'll do it. Hey, Brian, can you help me cut this here? Of course they're going to carry pre-cut lengths of material to tie somebody up. Obviously. I mean, there is something to say about it, that it shows that perhaps that this is someone who is very methodical, very calculating, very deliberate, maybe not very impulsive, but, I mean, once again, how can you not bring rope that isn't pre-cut, or clothesline, or any sort of material? How could you bring it not pre-cut? I mean, once again, that's just so obvious. And this will go to our next point, that both the Zodiac Killer and the Black Dahlia Avenger mailed in sketches of a knife to the press, and very specifically, a crude knife dripping with blood. That's something, but it's very little. Once again, it's a knife. It's an ordinary knife. What I would be expecting him to provide, does this knife have a Z on it? Does this knife have a circle with a cross going through it? If he had anything like that, I would say that's evidence that you had this depiction of a knife that has a circle with a cross going through it, and the Zodiac Killer also sent in an illustration of a knife with a cross going through it, a circle with a cross going through it, rather. That would be evidence. It's a knife. What, like if someone draws a picture of a handgun? Well, they both drew pictures of handguns, or if they drew pictures of rope, they both drew pictures of rope. I'll give them, rope would be a little bit more obscure, but some murderer is drawing a picture of a knife 20 years apart? What does that have to do with anything? All right, though. And their egomaniacal personalities demanded constant media publicity. Yeah, we did that one. And I would just say, though, that a lot of these things here are very, very general statements that lack a lot of specific information. They just do not have any sort of hard material other than the fact that they were both in California and they were both in, well, I mean, even the characteristics of the Black Dahlia Avenger and the way that he would have gone about these things are quite different. And when you listen to this video, Signature MO's Avenger Zodiac, it's like Steve Hodel even refers to the Black Dahlia Avenger as his father, George Hill Hodel. But then he says, some similarities between my father, George Hill Hodel, the Black Dahlia Avenger, and the Zodiac Killer, meaning that he's not even really certain his father's the Zodiac Killer. Does he even believe that his father was the Zodiac Killer? Highly improbable. Did he just come up with this to sell a book? Maybe he thought it was an interesting mental exercise, but I just can't accept that Steve Hodel even believes that his father's the Zodiac Killer. Nonetheless, he wrote a book about it. He wants to talk about it. He has this YouTube video out there with a lot of people leaving very positive comments, so let's challenge it. Both the Zodiac Killer and the Black Dahlia Avenger mailed cut-and-paste notes to the press and police. Once again, that's just a general statement. Do you ever watch those crime shows growing up? And I was like, why is everybody mailing in a cut-and-paste note? Why don't they just write it, gosh darn it? Well, they do that to hide their handwriting. I mean, this is just done by countless individuals. And with the Zodiac Killer, we really have a lot of inconsistencies in that as well. The Zodiac would do handwritten things, typewritten, and Steve Hodel says cut and paste. But there are a lot of pieces of Zodiac material. Placed excessive postage and multiple stamps on the taunting notes he mailed to the police, both done by the Black Dahlia Avenger and the Zodiac Killer. He used too many stamps? That's your evidence? All right. Used the press as his instrument to terrorize the public, promising there will be more. And I said before, I do give him credit for that. Most serial killers do not do that. I mean, that is a genuine similarity. Mailed more than a dozen notes to the police and press, feigning illiteracy and used misspellings and disguised his handwriting. Well, if we just said that we finished the Thomas Henry Horn theory, so there's some things to say about that. Thomas Henry Horn says it's not only that the Zodiac is disguising his handwriting, it's also that multiple people could have been writing the Zodiac letters and the Zodiac notes and even the things that you get on, like, the cards, because the card mailed to Paul Avery, spelled Averly, is very important in the George Hill Hodel theory. That was the one that had a very particular Celtic symbol that the French schoolteacher Yves Persson translated, saying that it's actually a combination of 5 different Celtic letters, and it spells out the name Hodel, Hodel. But when you do look at the signature on some of those things that contain that very specific symbol, there's that symbol, and then there's next to the Zodiac sign. It's almost like Hodel, Zodiac Killer is the signature. I think that's the only real thing that you have going for it, unless Yves Persson somehow knew Steve Hodel and they planned it together, which I think is highly improbable. They're on other opposite ends of the world. Unless that did happen, we got the internet, I don't know, but you have 2 different people making the claim who didn't know each other. That was the only thing that really attracted me to George Hill Hodel and even talking about him as a suspect. I had heard Steve Hodel on the television as a kid talking about the Black Dahlia Avenger, but I'd forgotten about him, to be honest, and I'd never really sat down and listened to his material on YouTube and read about him on the internet until I heard these connections to the Zodiac Killer case. But at the same time, what I would say about George Hill Hodel is just that you're dealing with somebody who's way too old to be the Zodiac Killer, and Steve Hodel doesn't even really think that his father was the Zodiac Killer. If I've gathered that, if I understood that, what he's rather saying is that there are just lots of similarities. I mean, maybe it's possible. Yeah, no, it's not possible. But he wrote the book anyway. And this is a big criticism that was mentioned on the Lord and Arts channel by John Lorden when he just said that so many people are trying to sell books about the case. And I was asking you guys, what Zodiac book would you like to hear a series on? We did the 15-part series on Thomas Henry Horn, and I was like, what book would you like to hear next? And someone said, any Zodiac book is fine. And I really just began to think, well, what is a Zodiac book that isn't written by somebody who's just trying to make money? What is a Zodiac book that is written by someone who's actually genuinely pushing a theory that they believe 100% in their heart and soul? And I would say that about Thomas Henry Horn. Some people have left comments on our Zodiac uploads about the Zodiac Killer hoax theory that he promotes, and they said Thomas Henry Horn was wrong about everything, and they give their explanations. That's fine, but does he genuinely believe this? Yes, I think he does. I don't get any sort of vibe that he is just making stuff up to sell books. And he openly says, though, that he puts his books out on Amazon for $2.99 because he wants people to buy them and he wants them to be inexpensive and to learn about them. Whereas that damn Lyndon Lafferty book is $34, and I'm just like, oh, come on. But, maybe we could talk about that one in the future. Was I like, though, do I really want to spend money on Steve Hodel's book about the Zodiac Killer? And just to hear these very general statements, well, they both owned a knife. Who cares? I mean, that's not any kind of hard evidence. And the entire Steve Hodel, George Hill Hodel, Zodiac Killer connection is not based on hard evidence, but mostly it is just to talk about how there are lots of similarities between them. And if you do want to say that, yes, there's similarities. All right, they both pre-cut pieces of clothesline to tie people up. They didn't carry the whole coil of rope with them. I'll give you that one, Steve. But anyway, that's all for me now. I would love to hear what you guys have to say. If you have any comments at all about Steve Hodel and the Black Dahlia Avenger or the Zodiac Killer. We mostly talk about the Zodiac Killer on this channel in comparison to that of the Black Dahlia. I've never done a single upload on the Black Dahlia Avenger. I would say, though, that when I've been looking into the stuff, Steve Hodel's comments about his father being the Black Dahlia Avenger and murdering Elizabeth Short, I believe that those are way more compelling. But at the same time, I'm not familiar with that one enough that I can call him out on his bullshit and be like, hey, that's not true because of this, this, and this. But at the same time, though, it's like, I mean, it's somewhat of a compelling case to someone who, like me, who is uninitiated in that particular true crime event. But anyway, what do you have to say about Steve Hodel and George Hill Hodel? Any comments at all? It doesn't only have to be about the Zodiac Killer. If you have anything to say at all about the books that Steve Hodel puts out, or just George Hill Hodel as a person. And once again, Steve Hodel's YouTube channel is simply titled just his name, Steve Hodel. And the video that I was discussing, where we got all of these things from, is called Signature M.O. Avenger Zodiac, Steve Hodel, Crime Comparisons. Until next time.